Okay, well, hello again, everyone, and welcome to our session today. My name is Anum. I live in New Delhi. I am a facilitator of empathy and compassion skill-based trainings, some of which to name are Compassionate Integrity Training Program, the C Learning Program, and Crossing Borders Education. I am also a board of trustee member for the Charter for Compassion, as well as our Global Youth Strategist, and I'm honored to be presenting this session on behalf of the Charter today for the wonderful Ubuntu Festival audience that we have here. So thank you again for joining us. And just before we get started, I'd love to put into the chat for anybody who would like to sign the Charter for Compassion. This is the link to that. There is a wonderful explanation of the declaration of the document, and we would love to have your signature on it, only because I think it very beautifully aligns with the concept of Ubuntu and everything that we are all trying to honor here by being present for a session like this. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please feel free at any point to raise your hand if you have a comment that you'd like to make, or you can use the chat to type in anything that you'd like. So we'd love to keep the session as interactive as possible. Okay, and you'll let me know if you can see my screen. All right, perfect. Okay. So again, today we're going to be exploring the wonderful virtues of common humanity and interdependence when we think of the true spirit of Ubuntu, which aligns so beautifully with, I think, these wonderful concepts and philosophies, and it really ties them in together. So again, it's just wonderful to be able to have this discussion about Ubuntu and the way that it shows up in all of our lives as we continue to really try to connect with the communities around us, as well as anything that we are trying to do on a personal and professional level. And what I'd love to do actually is start with a quick activity. And for that, there are about a few pictures here on the screen, 5 to be precise. And I would love for us to maybe just take 2 minutes. And if you're signing in from your phone, if you're not able to see the picture very clearly, just focus on the one that you can see. And I'd love just for you to focus on one individual or even more than one, and think of, or if you're able to, write down 2 things. And if you want to write more, that's absolutely fine. But 2 things that you think are different between you and the individual or the individuals that you choose on the screen. And after that, similarly, I'd love for you to take a minute and write down 2 things that you think you might have common with the same individual that you chose or individuals that you chose. So again, that's 2 things that are different and 2 things that are common. So maybe we can take 2 minutes to just collect our thoughts, and I will let you know when we're happy to go ahead and share. Maybe if we just take another 30 seconds to wrap up our thoughts. So again, 2 things that are common and 2 things that you think would be different. Okay. And I think with that, hopefully that was enough time. I'd love to ask anybody who is brave enough to share, and you don't really have to share what you thought was common and what you thought was perhaps different, as those might be personal reflections. But what I would like to pose to the group here is, do you think it was easier for you to describe the differences or the similarities? And please feel free to just unmute.
Yeah, I can jump in. It's such an interesting exercise because the things that came to my mind in terms of difference had to do with kind of like physical identity. Like I was like, okay, there's a difference in race, there's a difference in age, like were the two things that like I was thinking about difference. And then the invitation to think about what I had in common, I started to just imagine the life of this person. And it was like hardworking came to mind, and sort of like a caring personality. And I was like sort of like imagining the story of, so the similarities drew out a different kind of reflection to the differences. I just based it on sort of visual, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing. Would anybody else like to share?
Yeah, Isaac here. I would go ahead and say, I mean, I chose the soldier. I mean, basically, you know, if it's fine for me to share, I feel like I was assuming stuff again, like what Sarah mentioned. You know, what would be common and what would be different between the both of us. But let's say in plain sight, the the only difference I felt is he's a soldier. I'm not. And a common thing I felt is he loves dogs and I love dogs as well. So I feel, other than that, you know, what is visible in the picture, this is just, you know, like just looking at the picture, you can identify that. Other than that, if you have to assume, then I think there are lots of possibilities that you can actually come up with. But yeah.
Thank you, Isaac, for sharing. And it's wonderful to hear that you're a dog lover. I think so many of us are. So many commonalities there. Thank you. Would anybody else like to share before we move on? All right. Okay. And if you do feel like sharing at any point, please feel free to use the chat or just raise your hand and we can hear from you. But I think, again, just to explain the idea behind starting with this activity is, when we think of the concept of common humanity, or as some would also put it, as shared humanity, there is so much to unpack there in terms of our perception of other people who may not necessarily always, going back to what Sarah said, fit into the race that we are used to seeing or identifying with. And that pertains to so many different categories of the way we perceive human beings. That's gender, that's race, that could also be a particular affiliation for, let's say, even music or a political party. And we like to really categorize different human beings as different groups in our mind. So I'd love for you just to keep that thought at the surface of where we're going today in this presentation. And I would really like for us to keep coming back to this example as we go through some of the content that we're going to go through now. And the first thing that we're actually going to start with is bias. And this is a word that holds a lot, is very loaded in terms of the feelings it elicits, because of course we are well aware that in today's day and age, it is definitely tied in with a lot of negative consequences, as well as a lot of triggering emotions for people, because it is at the forefront of so much discrimination. But I'd love for us to take a bit of a neuroscientific deep dive into the formation of bias when it comes to our cognitive abilities to perceive. And for that, we really must honor the fact that creating categories is scientifically proven to be based on our natural need of identification. And what we really mean by that is, I will give us a very simple example. If you walk into a room and you see an object that has 4 legs and something is holding it up, and it looks like there is a backrest to it, automatically you will know that this object is a chair. And of course, right now we are speaking English, so that is the word for it in English, but I'm assuming a lot of us here are bilingual, or maybe more than just 2 languages that we speak. So whatever that language is, that is how we discern what that object is. And when we go back into our evolutionary history, creating categories was very important for human beings to evolve. And that is such to stories such as, let's say, we were human beings at a time where we lived in the outdoors and we lived in forests. And we know that somebody went up to a tree and ate the red fruit, and that didn't really do them very well. And let's say that caused them to become sick. So now we've categorized that red fruit as being something that might cause us harm. And in the future, we might not gravitate towards that tree and pick that red fruit to eat, right? Now, that is a category that we have created and that we live by, and actually really much serves the purpose of our survival. And what's very interesting is that when we look at bias from a neuroscientific perspective of the brain, in order to make that cognitive thought formation, that this category is something that is going to cause me harm, and now I know that, I will not interact with it anymore. And we take that concept and we extend it to the way that we view and perceive human beings. And if we take that small thought of the red fruit and we look at it in today's day and age in terms of putting, and Isaac, you said something so interesting when you were speaking about assumptions. And I think that is really at the forefront of how our bias plays out in categorization of human beings, right? Because we have some kind of a preconceived notion, if you will, or some kind of a stereotype when we are forming these categories. And while they may be helpful even in the context of human beings, for example, if you are traveling somewhere and somebody falls sick, the first thing you will call out to the group you might be traveling with is if somebody has a medical background. Again, that is a category, but it is one that is helpful to us. So we will automatically assume that someone who has the skills of a doctor or a healthcare provider in terms of medical benefit to the person who is in need, this is a good category and it's a helpful category. But when we start to form our perceptions in terms of gender, race, and so many other examples that we can put there, that is where our biases become a little problematic. And I think the real crux of the problem is also when we start to believe that the categories that we put people in, and whatever those categories may be, when we tell ourselves that these are absolute and not able to change, that is when we form a concrete opinion and we don't allow us to evolve from that categorization of a human being. And this leads us to exploring the concept of implicit and explicit biases, which, as the term suggests, implicit biases could be categorized as biases that we may feel for, and because we're speaking about common humanity, let's stick to just human beings and not necessarily all living beings. But when we speak of implicit biases, when it comes to human beings, this translates to biases that we may not necessarily consciously be aware of. And explicit biases are the opposite. They are those that we are consciously aware of, and that is where perhaps things like racism, very outward racism, finds its home. And implicit biases also finds its home for racism, because sometimes we may not necessarily know that we are being racist, but it is an unconscious bias that we have. And I would just like to take a pause here in case anybody would like to share or has a question. Please feel free to do that before we move on to the next slide. Okay, I'm going to take that as a we're good to go. And I think for the purpose of today's conversation, what is very interesting when we speak of the recognition and the appreciation of a concept like Ubuntu, or the philosophy of Ubuntu, which really upholds the beautiful acceptance of others around us, is a bias in particular that we call an in-group bias. An in-group bias can very loosely be defined, and I encourage you to read up more. There's so much research out there that has been done in terms of in-group bias, but just for the purpose of today, the definition that we're going with is an in-group is where you feel that you align with your identity again, so if we go back to race or gender, or the example I gave earlier as well, whether if I meet somebody who likes the exact same kind of music as I do, for me, that is my in-group in terms of my music taste. Or if I am in a room full of women, for me, it's an in-group because I am a woman. And these in-groups are also, of course, very helpful because you want to be able to identify your own identity with others and really honor that. But like biases, they become very complicated when we ostracize those who don't fall into our in-group. So if we just look at the content we have on the slides here, the creation of our in-groups and out-groups, again, as we discussed, is based on this natural tendency to create categories. And what we are calling a cognitive distortion, just to explain that, another term for it could be a thinking trap. And this is something that perhaps your cognitive abilities in your brain don't allow you to see. You are stuck on what you think is reality, but it may not necessarily be reality. So an in-group bias is most certainly a cognitive distortion, and it can lead to the common terms that we use in today's day and age as stereotyping. We may look at somebody from a particular gender and assume that they are weak or they are strong. And that is a stereotype because, like Isaac said, and he used the word assumption, we may not have enough factual evidence to come to that example, but we are going off of it just out of the creation of what we believe is an in-group or an out-group. And a lot of this stems back to psychological essentialism, which is a psychological term, and it is the belief that categories have a fixed underlying true nature that gives them their identity and is responsible for similarities that members of that category share. So much like what we discussed in terms of race and gender. And the idea with this belief is that it can exist even if one cannot name the essence of the group it is supposed to possess. So psychological essentialism, as well as stereotyping, is responsible for a great deal of outgroup discrimination. And I think it is wise to mention that the current time that we are living in terms of all of the geopolitical conflicts that we are seeing unfold, really hold true to this value, because essentially there is an in-group versus out-group conscious, I would suppose, memory that is kicking in here. And that is what we are seeing unfold in the geopolitical space, as well as in our own regions, where we see a lot of conflicts that unfortunately manifest through political leadership. So the idea here is, when we speak of common humanity and when we speak of the beautiful philosophy of Ubuntu, how do we eradicate the idea of an in-group bias and not really being able to communicate to others who, let's say, are not in our in-group? There are so many different strategies to work with here. And if we had more time, it would have been wonderful to go through all of them. But for the purpose of today, what I'd love to speak about is truly the value of empathy. And for that, I'm actually just going to stop sharing so I can see everybody's faces. Again, when we speak about the wonderful concept of empathy, this is a word that is so overplayed in today's society, especially with the really pushing forward of wanting to acquire emotional intelligence when we are presenting ourselves in the professional world as well as the personal world. But empathy it can best be described as really being able to feel a resonance with another. And there are many different forms of empathy, but just for the purpose of today, I'd love to focus on the idea of affective empathy and cognitive empathy. So affective empathy, again, it is our resonance with another, and cognitive empathy is our cognition to another. So let's say I can see Sarah, so I'm just going to take her as an example. If Sarah burns her hand and that causes her a great deal of pain, and if I have never been through something like that, or I don't think it's a painful experience, I may not necessarily have empathy for her in the affective sense because I can't relate to the feelings she's feeling, but my cognitive abilities will kick in and I will know that she has burnt her hand, and as human beings, if we touch something hot, our skin can burn. So perhaps my cognitive empathy will kick in for her. But what we really want to do is have affective and cognitive both, so we can have a full sense of empathy when we are trying to relate to another. And just to tie that in with the idea of biases, particularly in-group bias, Empathy is what we need to cultivate more deeply in order to be able to appreciate that common humanity with another. And that doesn't have to mean that we are consistently feeling empathy for our in-group, because again, as science and studies show, there is a wonderful hormone that is spoken about a lot. It is dubbed as the love hormone. It's called oxytocin. And this is a bonding hormone that has been shown to increase very highly when we are associating with our in-group. So if Sarah is in my in-group, perhaps I will feel that affective empathy for her and cognitive, because she's in my in-group, and I will most certainly feel empathy towards her. But if she was in my out-group, I don't know how far that would hold true given off of the definitions we have used today. And that is exactly the point that we are trying to overcome by educating ourselves through the lens of virtues such as empathy, which are neurobiologically wired in us. And that tells us that every single human being in the world is capable of empathy. Regardless of the actions that they partake in, it is something that we have been wired with, and it is something that through practice of really opening our skills to a deeper learning of the empathic concern that we have for others around us in our world, we can challenge the biases that are presented. For example, again, going back to the in-group bias that we see that is so prevalent in today's day and age, and perhaps this is the barrier to really allowing others to uphold and honor the concept of Ubuntu, because without practicing that common humanity for those that are in our out-group, we may never be able to really fully embrace the aspect of Ubuntu. Because if I don't think that you are at a level that requires my empathy, I will certainly not want to say that I am because you are. And I want to clarify, when I'm speaking from the I, that is not my personal opinion. It is for the purpose just of generalization in terms of what we see in so many different societies and cultures today. And it is important to mention that there are so many communities out there that are being able to uphold this philosophy of Ubuntu. And as an empathy and compassion facilitator, I would argue it's because they have a very high level of empathy, not only for their in-group, but also their out-group. And I think with that, I'm going to start sharing again. So if we go back to the slide deck and we come to this point of common humanity, this is a definition that we use in a lot of our trainings, but of course, there are so many other ways to define common humanity, but one of the definitions we can use is really being able, or I would say the ability to be able to focus on that which all human beings share, such as our wish for greater well-being and less suffering or even dissatisfaction. And the reason that this is the definition we are going with is there is always merit in going back to the foundation of a human being, whether they are in my out group or my in group, whether I can discern any similarities with them, or I feel that there are a lot of differences with them. For one to be able to come back to the point of you being a human being, this, of course, is a generalization, but in most cases, it holds true. That person A that I'm finding difficult to identify or align with, or even feel some kind of resonating feeling in terms of what they are saying or doing, if I hold this statement true to myself, then most likely it will hold true for them as well. That this human being also would want greater well-being in their life versus suffering. And that is why we give this particular definition of common humanity. As I said, there are so many other definitions out there, but just to bring it back again to the concept of Ubuntu, if there is no other way to deeply cultivate our empathy in regard to others that are in our in-group, in our out-group, the barrier to really breaking those biases that we see so often in today's day and age, a wonderful strategy is really to be able to come back to the fact that every human being at the very core desires for what we may desire for. Again, that is a gravitation towards greater well-being and less suffering. And I'd love to pause here and take any questions before we move on, because we will now be transitioning into watching a quick audio. So I want to stop sharing my screen just to prepare that. So if anybody would like to reflect or has any questions before we play the audio, please feel free. All right. Okay. So I have the audio ready, but just to give everybody a quick intro into what we're going to be listening to, we're going to be listening to an excerpt from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Christmas sermon. And interestingly enough, this would go on to be his last Christmas sermon before he was assassinated. So this took place at a Baptist church in Atlanta on December 24th, 1967. And I would love to share the YouTube clip with everybody here. It's a long sermon, but one that is so inspiring, as his words always are. But this particular excerpt is in regard to interdependence. And I think it is a beautiful segue when we are speaking about biases and our cognitive distortions when it comes to biases, and how that proves to be a roadblock for cultivating empathy and common humanity in order to uphold Ubuntu. Interdependence is such a key concept when it comes to the recognition of the other. And that might sound a little confusing, but hopefully when we listen to his audio, it will become clearer. And again, hopefully you are able to hear the sound. Please give me a thumbs up if you can hear it when I play.
It really boils down to this, that all life is interrelated. We are all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly, yes, sir, affects all indirectly. We are made to live together because of the interrelated structure of reality. And did you ever stop to think that you can't leave for your job in the morning without being dependent on most of the world? You get up in the morning and go to the bathroom and reach over for a sponge, and that's handed to you by a Pacific Islander. You reach for a bar of soap, and that's given to you at the hands of a Frenchman. And then you go in the kitchen to drink your coffee for the morning. That's poured in your cup by a South American. Or maybe you want tea. That's poured in your cup by a Chinese. Or maybe you're desirous of having cocoa for breakfast, and that's poured in your cup by a West African. And then you reach over for your toast, and that's given to you at the hands of an English-speaking farmer, not to mention the baker. And before you finish eating breakfast in the morning, you're dependent on more than half of the world. This is the way our universe is structured. It is its interrelated quality. We aren't going to have peace on earth until we recognize this basic fact of the interrelated structure of all reality. Now,
All right. I hope that audio was clear for everybody. And I'd love to just take a pause here, because every time I hear that, I know there's so many different thoughts that come to my mind. So I'd love to just open the conversation a bit for any reflections on what Dr. King has said, whether they have to do with what we're talking about or not. I think there's so much to unpack there.
Yeah, I mean, I those words are really inspiring. I think they are such an encouragement to consider how much we need each other, number one. And I think sometimes this idea of needing the other, and I mean, I disagree a little bit just with one of the things that he says. Is just like, everyone's in service, But I think there's something deeper to our connection, right? As human beings. And I think there's something about how we recognize that we are in service of each other. And even if there aren't like, there isn't really a physical symbolism of that, there is something in the heart space that's very necessary, that we need from the other. And I think that's also part of what we need to consider sometimes is this idea of our interdependence, is that it is based a lot on our ability to connect and our need to connect as humans, as people, right? So, but yeah, I think very, very inspiring.
Yeah. No, thanks so much for sharing that, Babs. And I love the way you put it and the challenge that you bring to the table. And I do think that there is a lack of this recognition of interdependence, even in our daily lives. And that's what I particularly love about the examples that he gives, because he speaks of the basic necessities in this particular person's day, or this might be aimed towards those who were living in the United States at the time. But even if we contextualize that to the world we live in today, I mean, I'm holding a pen in my hand, and often there are so many activities in trainings like this where they will have you map out the pen to go all the way to see how many individuals were involved in getting you that pen, and the number is usually infinite because it traces all the way back to not just the manufacturing companies, but the land that the manufacturing companies are on. So in the true acceptance of interdependence, it is this paradigm shift, I would say, of really recognizing that almost every single human being in the world has some kind of value add to our daily life, whether we spend our entire lives without understanding that or not. And the reason to bring in this concept of interdependence, really, because it ties in again so wonderfully with the concept of common humanity and empathy, because without the appreciation of interdependence, or even just the mere acknowledgement of it, we cannot move forward to a world where we see the philosophy of Ubuntu as definitely not just the exception, but the norm. And that is what I know everybody here is hoping for. And these are the key areas that we really need in our education systems, as well as just in our communities, even if that's in dialogue. So I love that you brought up the term heart-centered, because I think that is truly what, again, is lacking in so many of the systems that we see, which themselves are interconnected. But yes, thank you for sharing that. Would anybody else like to comment or share or add to what Babs has said?
I think I do agree with what we discussed with respect to how we have to actually look into examples of interdependency in our lives, just to identify that everyone is connected somehow. I mean, the basic the basic connection as humans, wherever you are, and the way in which we are connected, maybe through genes or through such millions of years of history, is not always looked into. So I think I feel like what you would have mentioned is you have to put in work to actually identify these connections that are there, so that you feel part of the part of the world, or part of the universe, or however that is. So I feel like there is this there is a saying where I forgot who said it. No man is an island. You're all connected to the mass. So I feel like that is what we are trying to achieve as a global consciousness. And I feel understanding that interdependency, and understanding that what happens in one part of the world is reflected, or the ripples does go through all around the world, is something that we as humans, or we as especially youngsters, need to understand. So I feel that is where change happens, or change starts, and I feel like sessions like this, or even moving forward, having that kind of setting those examples from people who have experienced those would make a big change when it comes to spreading the message. So I feel we are here experiencing this change, and we share that message to others as well. So yeah, I mean the speech, I mean the speech by him is very inspiring, and thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Isaac. I really appreciate what you said about change. I think it's so interesting to take a moment to reflect on that, because even in his sermon, that's what the excerpt closes with. He comments on peace, and that not being something that is attainable without this recognition and rather deep appreciation of interdependence and interconnectedness. And I think when you speak of change and you speak of the youth particularly, this is something that we really are seeing at the forefront of so much vocalization today, whether that is for protests of what people believe should be happening, or whether that is just standing up for some kind of social justice or equity. Anything that we look at, it really ties down to this concept of honoring human values and honoring human rights. And it's so interesting when you think of change at that macro level. It is impossible, again, to look at it without the interdependent aspect, because no true change can unfold with one person alone. So even in that system of change that we see with different organizations or communities that are working towards peace, it is definitely a trickle-down effect in order for it to truly be successful. So thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's always so wonderful to hear these different perspectives. And I know that we have a comment in the chat by Mateka. If it's okay with you, Mateka, I'm gonna read it out. Mateka says, actually, my view about this is that it leads to improved conflict resolution. When people recognize their interdependence, they are more likely to approach conflicts constructively, seeking solutions that benefit all parties involved. This is because the success and well-being of one individual are seen as interconnected with those of others. That's so beautifully put. Thank you so much, Mateka. I feel like you articulated exactly what I was trying to say, only in a much more beautiful way. So thank you for sharing your thoughts. And with that, we're actually going to be doing a quick breakout room for our mindful dialogue. And before we do that, I'd love just to go back to the slide deck and present to you. We've spoken so much about interdependence, but this is, again, as the same for common humanity. There are so many different definitions that we can abide by. This one particularly comes from the Positive Peace Report, and it says individuals are part of a vast ecosystem where they are dependent on other individuals, institutions, and the environment to survive and thrive, and where individual actions similarly affect others. I believe that this really encapsulates everything that we just spoke about in our discussion of interdependence. And just to take this conversation with, I know we don't have that much time left, so maybe we can do about 8 minutes for our mindful dialogue, or maybe we do 6, actually. So just to go over a mindful dialogue concept, since we have a really intimate group, this will be wonderful to do. So we're going to go into breakout rooms, 2 people in 1 breakout room. And as the name suggests, we want to be mindful and really participate and present active listening to our partner in the group. There are 2 questions here. So person A will answer their questions first, and then person B can answer their questions after. So we want to be able to give you room to be able to speak at a more personal level when we reflect on everything that we've been speaking about today, and then we could come back in the main room and have a larger discussion. So I'm just going to go over the questions. I'll put them in the chat as well. As we reflect on the essentiality of Ubuntu, interdependence, and common humanity to strengthen the interconnectedness of our communities, does the intentional perspective and practice of these concepts impact how you view the systems you would like to make a positive impact in. And the second question is, what do you think are some of the challenges and barriers to truly embrace these concepts? And I will go ahead and put them in the chat as well, so we all have them. There we go. Hopefully they should transfer with you into your breakout room. And if we're ready to go, again, we can just do 3 minutes each, so 6 minutes in total, and then we can come back and debrief in the main room. Welcome back, everyone. I hope everybody had enough time to share. And I know we only have about 2 minutes left, but I'd love to hear some of the reflections from the room. And we did have somebody else join us while you guys were in your breakout rooms.
Yeah, I can share from our group. And Mateka, if you want to add anything. And hello, Lupios, it's really good to see you. Welcome. So I think, so where Mateka and I started was in talking about just kind of these questions of like, why don't people feel that sense of like the challenges and barriers piece? Like, why don't people feel a sense of common humanity when there's like wars going on, people being, you know, at all that is, I mean, there's so many examples that like come to mind, you know, at the moment. And kind of where just almost like a sense of despair of like, where does this apathy and just like feeling of not connection come from? And are we too kind of caught up in our own worlds to actually practice that, the exercise of empathy? And I think that's your presentation, Anum, is really inviting the practice of empathy and kind of how to do it, and that it has to be almost like a conscious choice. And so like, how do you encourage people to like make that conscious choice? So we were kind of commiserating a little bit about the those barriers. And then Mateka said something that was really nice, just about in our own work and like in the cooperation circle that Mateka is part of, how kind of an encouragement to create a working environment where we are interdependent on each other. So even if we're just in a small like team or community, how can you use that to model the kind of interdependence that we're talking about? So to really give, again, I think to give people a chance to like to practice it. So it was a nice example. That was some of what we shared. I don't know, Mateka, do you want to add anything?
Not really, but yeah, you've spoken it well. That was actually the point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah and Mateka. It sounds like you had a really interesting discussion. So thank you for sharing that with us. And would anybody else like to share from the other group?
I'll give it to Babs. And then maybe I could add something to it.
Yeah, I think Isaac and I had a really interesting conversation, and it was really focused on I think also again the challenges, because I think and you really put together a wonderful analysis for us to dive deep into. And I think one of the things that we're really contemplating is what is the practice of embedding those principles into our systems? How do we make our workplaces, our our community spaces, how do we embed those ideas of the idea of empathy and practice it, right? Especially when our systems are very results driven and our systems, are outcome based. And so when we have a result competing with our need to empathize, how do we shift that? And so I think one of the things that Isaac said was just around how, like, this next generation, the youth are quite actively wanting to see empathy embedded. And I think we are at that crossroads in our society right now where it's like, the system should be created for and by us. And so what are the standards we want to set for that? And I think empathy is very much this should be the central focus of that. But yeah, I think that's basically what we spoke about. Isaac, you can jump in and and share more.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, 6 minutes. Oh, as always, 6 minutes was very less for a for a good conversation. But still, I mean, let's see. As mentioned, I feel like there is each generation has more exposure, and we talked about it. More exposure from the social norms, or the structure that is set up traditionally, and just understanding that every generation has their own identity, and they come up with such ideas, new ideas. So I feel like having this structure, having a social structure is not anymore a barrier as of now. When we start thinking of this stuff, I mean, we are more open when it comes to, when we compare with our parents or our old generation. So I mean, and the coming teens or kids would be much more could relate much more to these topics. So I feel that is the change that is happening. So yeah, and we both agreed on it. So yeah.
Thank you so much, Isaac and Babs, for sharing. It's interesting that both groups focused more on the second question, and I think that really speaks to this deconstruction of what the obstacles and barriers are in our societies, wherever we are in the world, to really be able to honor the philosophy of Ubuntu through the intentional practice of empathy, common humanity, the appreciation of this undeniable and inescapable network of mutuality that we are calling interdependence. So it's wonderful to hear those perspectives. And I am aware that we've gone 5 minutes over time, so apologies for that. And I think with that, we'll close the session. And I just want to take a minute to extend my gratitude to everybody who is able to participate today. Thank you so much for taking out the time to be here, for your participation, and much appreciation and deep gratitude to Babs and Sarah for inviting me to participate and host this session. I know it was a very short one, but I look forward to continuing this dialogue in our collective spaces as we really continue to work towards fully embracing a beautiful philosophy like Ubuntu in every facet of our lives. So thank you very much. And with that, I will close the session. So thank you for being here, and have a wonderful evening ahead.